On a rain-slick night in October 1872, a junior draftsman in a dimly lit government office in Washington unfolded a map that was never meant to be seen by the public. By morning, that map would be gone, locked away in a steel cabinet, stamped "confidential," and replaced with a version that quietly erased an entire American frontier from existence. For nearly 50 years, the American people believed they knew their own country. They believed the West had been measured, claimed, settled, and understood. They believed the bold lines on their atlases told the truth. They were wrong. This is the story of the Great Map Deception, how cartographers, politicians, railroad barons, and land speculators conspired to redraw America not as it was, but as they needed it to be. It begins long before 1872, in the raw aftermath of the Civil War, when the United States was desperate for unity, wealth, and expansion. The war had ended in 1865, but the country was fractured, economically, politically, and psychologically. The solution, many believed, lay in the West. The frontier would be the nation's salvation. Newspapers glorified it. Pamphlets romanticized it. Politicians promised it. But there was a problem. The maps were wrong. Throughout the mid-19th century, much of the American West was still only partially surveyed. Expeditions had traced rivers, climbed mountains, and crossed deserts, but vast swaths remained imperfectly measured. Elevations were estimated, rivers were mischarted, entire valleys appeared where none existed. Some mountain passes were misplaced by miles. More dangerously, some of the most desirable lands, the ones railroad companies were desperate to acquire, were not as fertile or accessible as earlier surveys suggested. The federal government had tied land grants to railroad expansion. For every mile of track laid, companies received alternating square-mile sections of public land stretching outward from the rails. These grants were based on survey maps, maps that determined value, settlement, and future state boundaries. If the maps changed, fortunes would change. In 1867, Congress quietly consolidated several surveying operations into a more centralized structure, hoping to standardize the chaotic patchwork of frontier cartography. Officially, this was about efficiency. Unofficially, it was about control. Among the new generation of surveyors was Thomas Alder, a mathematically gifted but politically naive mapmaker from Ohio. Alder believed maps were sacred documents, scientific instruments that translated wilderness into knowledge. He joined a federal surveying expedition in 1869, tasked with remapping portions of the Northern Plains and the Rocky Mountain territories. What he found unsettled him. In Wyoming Territory, Alder discovered that several previously published maps overstated the availability of arable land by staggering margins. Regions advertised in Eastern newspapers as the next agricultural paradise were semi-arid, prone to drought, and unsuited to large-scale farming without irrigation technology that did not yet exist. More troubling was what he discovered about the rail corridor running westward. The route selected for expansion avoided a more stable mountain pass known to indigenous tribes for centuries. Instead, the railroad had carved through a far harsher stretch of terrain. Why? Because the chosen route passed through millions of acres of land granted to a consortium of investors, land that would skyrocket in value once a rail line touched it. If the easier mountain pass were officially recognized on federal maps, future routes could bypass those holdings entirely. Alder recorded the accurate topography in his field journals. He sketched the alternative pass in precise detail. He believed his findings would improve future planning and save lives. When he submitted his revised maps in Washington, He expected praise. Instead, he was summoned. The meeting took place in a wood-paneled office in the Department of the Interior. Present were 2 senior survey officials and a representative from a major railroad syndicate. Alder recognized the man immediately from newspaper illustrations. They praised his diligence. Then they explained why his corrections could not be published. The American public, they said, needed confidence in the West. Investors needed certainty. Settlers needed encouragement. To revise major geographic features so dramatically would undermine land values, disrupt migration patterns, and create unnecessary confusion. Confusion, in this case, meant financial panic. The railroads were the arteries of national recovery. Their bonds were traded in New York and London. European investors poured capital into American expansion based on the stability of federal land surveys. If key routes appeared poorly chosen, or worse, corruptly selected, the ripple effects could destabilize markets. So the maps would remain as they were. Alder protested. He argued that scientific integrity demanded correction. One of the officials responded with chilling clarity. Mr. Alder, maps do not merely describe the nation, they create it. Within weeks, his revised drafts were archived under restricted classification. Public editions continued to show the old routes and exaggerated agricultural potential. But the deception deepened. By the early 1870s, rumors of fertile valleys in the Northern Territories had sparked a migration surge. Settlers arrived by the thousands, lured by brochures depicting lush farmland. Many found themselves confronting unforgiving soil and unpredictable weather. Crop failures mounted. Yet the maps still showed promise. Behind closed doors, a quiet practice had emerged among certain government cartographers: selective omission. Dry riverbeds were labeled as seasonal streams. Elevation gradients were softened to make terrain appear more manageable. Distances between water sources were subtly compressed. None of these changes were dramatic enough to spark outrage. Each was small, technical, dismissible. Together, they reshaped reality. Railroad companies benefited enormously. Land near their tracks sold quickly. Towns sprang up along routes that would otherwise have been considered marginal. Speculators flipped parcels to incoming families who trusted the authority of federal surveys. Meanwhile, indigenous nations who knew the land intimately watched as official maps erased their established routes and knowledge. Traditional mountain passes went unmarked. Established trails disappeared from government publications. Instead, rail lines defined the geography of the West. Control the map, control the narrative. In 1872, a congressional committee quietly requested an internal review of Western surveys after complaints from settlers began reaching Washington. Thomas Alder, now more cautious but still principled, saw an opportunity. He retrieved copies of his original Wyoming drafts and compared them to the publicly distributed maps. The differences were undeniable. The easier mountain pass, long known by local tribes and even by earlier explorers, was absent. Entire stretches of marginal land were colored in fertile greens. A river that ran dry for months each year was depicted as perennial. Alder compiled a report detailing the discrepancies. He did not accuse anyone directly. He framed it as scientific clarification. The report was submitted, and then it vanished. Weeks passed with no response. When Alder inquired, he was told the committee had deferred action. Shortly afterward, he was reassigned to a minor clerical role far from field surveys. The message was clear. But the deception could not remain hidden forever. The winter of 1873 to 74 was brutal across the plains. Crop failures intensified. Railroad maintenance costs soared along the more treacherous mountain routes. Bond markets grew nervous. Financial panic erupted in 1873, triggering a severe economic depression. While many factors contributed to the panic of 1873, including overextended rail financing and speculative bubbles, few realized how deeply cartographic misrepresentation had amplified the damage. Investors had been promised geographic certainty that did not exist. In the years that followed, independent surveyors began publishing contradictory findings. Agricultural journals questioned soil assessments. Travelers wrote accounts describing terrain far harsher than official maps suggested. Gradually, a pattern emerged. By the 1880s, investigative journalists were probing the cozy relationships between land offices, railroad executives, and certain surveying officials. Congressional hearings were proposed, but resistance was fierce. Maps were treated as neutral tools. To suggest manipulation seemed almost absurd. Yet evidence accumulated. Thomas Alder, nearing retirement, provided private testimony to a reform-minded senator. He described the suppressed pass, the altered river markings, the archived drafts. He spoke carefully, aware of potential retaliation. The senator pushed for transparency legislation, requiring that original survey notes be preserved and made accessible. Reform came slowly. Over time, federal mapping standards improved. Independent geological surveys were strengthened. Scientific rigor gained ground over political convenience. But the legacy of the great map deception endured. Entire towns had been founded based on optimistic cartography. Some survived through adaptation and irrigation innovation. Others became ghost towns, casualties of misplaced expectation. Railroads eventually adjusted routes, though rarely admitting earlier errors. Investors absorbed losses. Settlers bore the brunt of broken promises. Perhaps most profound was the realization that maps were not passive reflections of reality. They were instruments of power. In the early 20th century, historians revisiting 19th-century survey archives discovered discrepancies between field notes and published editions. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Whenever geographic truth threatened powerful financial interests, the truth bent. Thomas Alder died in relative obscurity in 1903. His journals, donated by his family decades later, became crucial evidence for scholars studying the intersection of cartography and capital in America's westward expansion. Today, when we unfold a map or zoom in on a digital satellite image, we assume accuracy, we assume neutrality. But the great map deception reminds us that geography has always been political. Borders are argued into existence. Routes are chosen for profit. Resources are highlighted or hidden based on who stands to gain. In the 19th century, altering a contour line or omitting a mountain pass could redirect migration, reshape markets, and determine the fate of communities. The American frontier was not merely conquered by rail and rifle, it was engineered with ink. And for a time, the nation believed every line, because it wanted to.
By the time the 19th century drew toward its close, the ink had dried on thousands of maps that defined how Americans understood their continent. School children memorized them. Railroad companies framed them in corporate offices. Land agents pinned them to courthouse walls in small frontier towns. Few questioned them. But beneath the bold black lines and confident topographic shading lay decades of quiet distortion. Choices made not in the field beneath an open sky, but in offices where economic pressure pressed heavier than mountain air. After Thomas Alder's sidelining in 1872, a new generation of federal surveyors emerged. Some were idealists, others pragmatists, and a few were openly entangled with railroad and mining interests. What distinguished this era was not simply the manipulation of geography, it was the systemization of it. The United States Geological Survey, USGS, formally established in 1879, was tasked with bringing scientific consistency to the nation's mapping efforts. On paper, its mission was noble: classify public lands, examine geological structures, and evaluate mineral resources. In practice, it operated within a political ecosystem where information equaled leverage. The West was no longer merely a frontier, it was a ledger. Coal seams in Wyoming, silver deposits in Nevada, timber in Montana. These were not just natural features, they were entries in financial portfolios, and maps were prospectuses. Cartographers learned quickly that what they emphasized could shape speculation. If a geological map shaded an area in tones suggesting probable mineral wealth, investment surged. If that shading disappeared in a later edition, land values plummeted. The power was intoxicating and dangerous. In 1881, an internal memo circulated within a regional survey office in Colorado Territory. It warned that premature disclosure of uncertain mineral potential may destabilize existing claims and impair commercial confidence. The language was bureaucratic, but its implication was clear. Maps were to be managed as economic instruments. The survey teams working in the San Juan Mountains discovered that several mining districts had been overstated in earlier promotional materials distributed by land agents. The veins of silver were thinner than advertised. The terrain was more unstable. Yet the official topographic sheets still depicted the region as a reliable hub of extraction. Correcting the maps would not merely adjust lines, it would expose exaggeration bordering on fraud. So revisions were delayed. Meanwhile, railroads continued to extend their reach, sometimes following routes that engineering assessments privately criticized. In Montana, an alternative corridor along a river valley offered lower grades and reduced maintenance costs. Indigenous guides had long used the path, recognizing its seasonal stability. But the chosen railroad route climbed through a harsher pass. Why again? Because land ownership along the steeper corridor was controlled by a syndicate whose political connections reached into Washington. Their holdings were mapped with meticulous care, streams clearly marked, timber density optimistically rendered, terrain subtly smoothed. The gentler valley appeared, but its advantages were understated. This pattern repeated across the West. Maps did not fabricate entire mountains or rivers from nothing. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they exaggerated, minimized, omitted. A canyon might be shown slightly narrower, a swamp labeled marshland rather than impassable wetland, a water source drawn a mile closer to a proposed settlement site. Each decision could be defended individually as interpretation. Collectively, they altered destiny. By the mid-1880s, the consequences were measurable. Agricultural failure rates in certain western counties far exceeded projections based on federal soil assessments. Railroad repair budgets ballooned due to snow accumulation and landslides in passes portrayed as manageable. Mining ventures collapsed when ore yields failed to match the optimism suggested by geological shading. Yet accountability remained elusive. Maps carried the aura of authority. They bore seals, signatures, and federal insignia. To challenge them required expertise few settlers possessed. When homesteaders complained that the permanent creek on their land ran dry by midsummer, local officials often dismissed it as seasonal variance. The maps, after all, said otherwise.
Thomas Alder, in quiet retirement, began corresponding with younger surveyors who privately expressed frustration. Through letters preserved decades later, a picture emerges of internal conflict within the mapping establishment. One surveyor wrote in 1886, We are instructed not to alter certain boundary notations without departmental clearance, though field observation indicates clear inaccuracy. I am beginning to suspect that precision is not the priority." Another confided, "The rail agents attend our briefings more frequently than agricultural scientists." Alder advised caution. He had learned the cost of open confrontation. Instead, he urged meticulous documentation. Retain field notebooks, preserve drafts, record dates. "Truth," he wrote, "must be archived, even if it cannot be printed." The turning point began not with a whistleblower, but with technology. Advances in photography and triangulation in the late 19th century improved geographic measurement dramatically. Surveyors could now verify elevations and distances with greater precision. Discrepancies between older maps and new instruments became harder to dismiss as minor variation. When a series of updated surveys in the Dakotas revealed that certain rail-adjacent lands were significantly more flood-prone than earlier maps indicated, insurance companies took notice. Claims mounted after repeated seasonal inundations damaged track and settlement infrastructure. Actuarial tables did not care about political alliances. Insurance investigators began comparing Federal Survey editions across decades. Subtle alterations emerged. River floodplains had been gradually narrowed in official renderings during peak railroad expansion years, then widened again after track placement was secured. The pattern was difficult to explain innocently. In 1893, as another economic depression gripped the nation, populist political movements gained strength across Western states. Farmers' alliances and reform advocates began scrutinizing the nexus of federal authority and corporate power. Maps became evidence. At a fiery town hall meeting in Kansas, a speaker held up two government-issued maps printed 12 years apart. He pointed to a region labeled Prime Agricultural Belt in the earlier edition. In the newer one, the same area bore a more cautious designation. "What changed?" he demanded, "the soil or the stock price?" The crowd understood. Congress could no longer ignore mounting discontent. In 1894, a subcommittee quietly requested access to archived field notes from several Western surveys conducted in the 1970s and 1980s. What they found was not a single smoking gun, but a mosaic of adjustments that consistently favored powerful interests during critical moments of expansion. In some cases, original elevation measurements had been rounded down, reducing apparent engineering challenges. In others, marginal lands had been categorized with optimistic terminology, inconsistent with field descriptions. The deception was rarely blatant enough to prosecute as criminal fraud. It existed in the gray zone of discretion. But morally, it was devastating. Settlers who had risked everything to move west confronted the reality that their decisions had been shaped by selective representation. Indigenous communities saw further validation of what they had long known, that official documents often bore little resemblance to lived reality. The committee's final report, released in cautious language, acknowledged inconsistencies between preliminary field documentation and published cartographic editions during periods of significant land disposition. It recommended stricter archival requirements and clearer revision histories for future maps. It stopped short of naming individuals. Railroad executives publicly denied influencing survey outputs. Federal officials emphasized the challenges of mapping vast, untamed territories with evolving technology. Both statements contained elements of truth, but neither addressed the central fact. Economic incentives had quietly steered geographic representation. By the early 20th century, professional standards in cartography began to shift decisively toward transparency. Revision dates were printed more clearly. Methodologies were documented. Independent academic geographers gained influence. The culture of quiet alteration grew harder to sustain, yet the legacy endured in subtle ways. Property boundaries established during the height of expansion often remained legally binding even after revised surveys revealed inaccuracies. Entire counties had been delineated using imperfect baselines. Water rights disputes traced back to rivers whose courses had been mischarted in early editions. In some regions, court cases in the 1910s and 1920s hinged on whether original survey markers or later corrected maps should prevail. The ink of the 1870s still shaped arguments decades later. Thomas Alder did not live to see the broader reckoning, but his preserved journals, rediscovered by historians in the 1930s, provided a rare insider's view into the ethical struggles within federal cartography. Scholars analyzing his notes concluded that while no single conspiracy orchestrated every alteration, a culture of accommodation had flourished. Surveyors understood, often implicitly, which corrections would be welcomed and which would stall careers. The great map deception was not a dramatic midnight forgery. It was 1,000 quiet decisions. It was the softening of a contour line here, the optimistic shading of farmland there. It was the omission of an indigenous trail that challenged a railroad's chosen path. It was the delay of a correction until after bonds were sold and land deeds finalized. And it worked. America expanded. Railroads connected oceans, towns rose and fell, fortunes were made and lost. Through it all, maps projected certainty. Today, historians and geographers look back on that era, not with simple condemnation, but with sober recognition. The pressure to present stability during national expansion was immense. The temptation to align geography with ambition proved irresistible. But the lesson resonates beyond the 19th century. Every map tells a story. Every projection emphasizes something and diminishes something else. Political boundaries, resource indicators, demographic shading, each reflects choices. The great map deception reminds us that objectivity requires vigilance. When Thomas Alder first unfolded that suppressed draft in 1872, he believed truth alone would prevail. He underestimated the gravity of economic power. Yet his insistence on preserving accurate field notes ensured that eventually the full picture could be reconstructed. In the end, America's true frontier was not just a place on the continent. It was the boundary between knowledge and narrative. And for a time, narrative won.